We all intimately know the terrifying ancient myth of Medusa, the horrifying monster whose very gaze instantly turns living, breathing creatures into solid stone. It is a brilliant, terrifying fantasy, but the grim reality of nature is far more morbid than fiction. Deep in the blistering heat of Tanzania's Great Rift Valley sits Lake Natron. It is a massive, sprawling cauldron of bloody red, hyper-caustic water that literally calcifies the soft bodies of the birds and bats that accidentally crash into it, slowly turning them into eternal, perfectly preserved statues of solid salt. This is absolutely not magic. It is extreme, heavily documented geochemistry. But the petrified stone mummies are only the second most shocking thing about this bizarre landscape. The true horror is the massive, thriving, highly active ecosystem living entirely inside the acid. In this video, we're diving deep into the Medusa Lake, from the bizarre volcanic ash that poisons the water to the terrifying chemical mummification process to the incredible evolutionary hack that keeps millions of beautiful birds alive in a literal death trap. So, how exactly does a serene body of water slowly mutate into a highly concentrated chemical weapon? It all starts with the geography of the trap. Lake Natron is what geologists call an endorheic basin. This simply means that water constantly flows into the massive depression, but it absolutely never flows out. There are no rivers draining it to the ocean. The only way water ever leaves this valley is through relentless evaporation under the blistering, unforgiving African sun. And as that water rapidly evaporates, it leaves heavy, concentrated minerals permanently behind. But the lethal catch is, this isn't your normal, everyday table salt. Looming ominously over the valley is the massive Oldoyonyo Lengai volcano. It is completely unique. It is the only active volcano on Earth that violently erupts nitrocarbonatite. It is a bizarre, ultra-runny, highly alkaline black magma. When the heavy seasonal rains arrive, they brutally wash massive amounts of this rare, toxic volcanic ash straight down the slopes and directly into the trapped basin of the lake. The chemical pH of the water violently spikes to 10.5. If you dipped your arm into this water, the exact same chemical reaction that aggressively dissolves heavy grease in your household oven cleaner would immediately begin breaking down your living skin cells. It is as horribly caustic as pure ammonia. This extreme alkalinity turns the massive lake into a bubbling chemical bath that violently burns the eyes and exposed skin of any unadapted animal foolish enough to enter. And the terrifying, bright, bloody red color of the water is nature's final, glaring warning sign. It entirely comes from massive blooms of extremophile cyanobacteria. These are the absolute only microscopic organisms on the planet tough enough to survive the blistering poison. But highly toxic caustic water usually just kills things and rapidly rots them away. To truly understand how Lake Natron meticulously mummifies its victims, we have to look closely at an ancient chemical compound deeply hidden beneath the red surface. Let's establish the absolute baseline of natural death. When an animal tragically dies and falls into a normal lake, scavengers quickly eat the remains or aggressive bacteria rapidly decompose the soft tissue. But inside the caustic waters of Lake Natron, normal bacteria simply cannot survive. The everyday flesh-eating microbes that actively cause rot and decay are immediately destroyed by the intensely high pH. The dead bodies don't rot, they just silently float. This brings us to the lake's highly specific namesake, natron. It is a naturally occurring, highly concentrated mixture of sodium carbonate decahydrate. Make no mistake, that complex chemical name should sound incredibly familiar to you. It is the exact same chemical compound the ancient Egyptians aggressively used to meticulously dry out and mummify their pharaohs. The entire lake is essentially a massive open-air mummification vat. The incredibly still, perfectly flat surface of the lake is highly reflective, acting exactly like a giant mirror reflecting the harsh sky. Unsuspecting birds and bats accidentally dive straight into it, thinking they are flying into empty space. Once they hit the hyper-alkaline water, they are trapped. The caustic chemicals rapidly strip away all of their protective body fat and forcefully replace their soft biological tissue with rock-hard crystallized minerals. As the water level slowly drops during the brutal dry season, the receding waters leave behind terrifying, perfectly preserved calcified gargoyles sitting quietly on the shore. The lake is a flawless, natural, highly efficient slaughterhouse. Because of this terrifying mechanism, you would logically assume it is completely devoid of any complex biological life. But the incredible truth is exactly the opposite. The absolute deadliness of the water is heavily established. A single splash can cause agonizing chemical burns. So how in the world could anything survive here? The deadliest, most toxic lake on the entire African continent is actually the sole critical breeding ground for 75% of the world's lesser flamingos. It is a massive, shocking biological paradox. The lake should be completely barren, but it is routinely filled with 2 million bright pink birds. If a hungry predator, a desperate hyena, an aggressive baboon, or a massive marabou stork tries to wade into the shallow water to hunt and eat the birds, it immediately suffers agonizing, debilitating chemical burns and is forced to desperately retreat. The terrifying toxicity of the lake is an impassable, flesh-burning moat of absolute agony. It is the ultimate security system. But how do the flamingos survive it without their fragile legs literally melting off? They have developed an incredible evolutionary hack. The lesser flamingo has evolved incredibly tough, thick, highly specialized leathery scales on its long legs to entirely resist the caustic chemical burns. They literally drink near-boiling, highly pressurized fresh water directly from the geothermal geysers erupting on the lake's jagged edge. And they use their highly specialized, intricate bills to safely filter feed the massive blooms of toxic red cyanobacteria directly from the poison water. And incredibly, absorbing those toxic extremophiles is exactly what turns their feathers bright pink. If you are completely blown away by the incredible fact that massive flocks of flamingos actively use a deadly acid bath as a biological security system, hit the like button right now to help feed the algorithm. So, the tough flamingos have successfully adapted to survive the burning water, but they still have to physically build delicate nests to protect their fragile eggs. And the highly specific way they construct their nurseries is a terrifying, high-stakes gamble with the extreme weather.
Flamingos absolutely need wet mud to physically build their tall, highly specific cone-shaped nests. The primary goal is to elevate their single, fragile eggs safely out of the boiling, toxic water below. But in order to access that crucial mud, they rely entirely on the intense, blistering dry season to heavily evaporate the water and expose the flat mud bed sitting directly in the center of the caustic lake. It is a highly dangerous, razor-thin margin of biological error. If the heavy rains unexpectedly return too fast, the massive lake quickly refills, the highly alkaline water rapidly rises, aggressively floods the delicate nests, and completely destroys the entire colony's generation of eggs. But the opposite is just as lethal. If the dry season is too long and it stays entirely too dry, the lake shrinks completely, the protective acid moat entirely disappears, and those terrestrial predators can simply walk safely across the dry salt flats to violently massacre the helpless chicks. The stakes could not possibly be higher. The entire global population of lesser flamingos entirely depends on this highly specific, incredibly deadly, perfectly balanced chemical fortress.
They absolutely do not survive in spite of the horrifying toxicity. They completely and utterly require it. Lake Natron isn't just a bizarre death trap, it is a vital, irreplaceable biological shield. But this incredibly delicate chemical fortress is currently facing a massive looming threat that absolutely no amount of toxic water can stop. For millions of years, the Medusa Lake has successfully survived and protected its fragile inhabitants solely because of its extreme geographical isolation. No one wanted to go near the caustic water. But the terrifying modern threat is human industry. There are massive, highly lucrative proposed plans to build a sprawling soda ash extraction plant directly on the delicate shores, and massive hydroelectric dams aggressively siphoning water from the vital rivers that slowly feed the lake. The brutal irony of the situation is incredibly hard to grasp. Altering the natural water flow would significantly dilute the intense toxicity. It would actually make the water substantially cleaner. And that is the absolute nightmare scenario. If the hyper-alkaline lake becomes significantly less toxic, it completely dies. The massive blooms of red cyanobacteria die out, immediately starving the flamingos. The highly caustic chemical moat completely disappears, instantly allowing terrestrial predators free access to the nests. If we aggressively clean up the Medusa Lake to make it safe, we will directly trigger the violent extinction of millions of beautiful birds. The paradox is absolute. The singular, only way to save the fragile ecosystem is to fiercely keep the lake as a deadly, flesh-burning cauldron. Lake Natron ultimately proves that Earth's absolute most hostile, terrifying environments are often its most vital, protected sanctuaries. But it also aggressively forces us to completely rethink everything we know about finding biological life out in the dark universe.
Nature simply does not deal in the fragile human concepts of good or bad. To us, a hyper-alkaline chemical bath that aggressively petrifies bats is a horrifying nightmare. But that exact same terrifying mechanism is what flawlessly keeps an entire species of beautiful birds alive. Toxicity is completely subjective. But this revelation leaves us staring at a massive, deeply unsettling unknown. If a deadly acid lake can aggressively support a massive, thriving ecosystem right here on Earth, what exactly does that mean for the highly toxic, freezing liquid lakes we see on other planets? Are we completely looking for alien life in the wrong places? Could extreme, lethal toxicity actually be a fundamental prerequisite for biological survival elsewhere in the solar system? To explore the freezing methane lakes of Titan and the terrifying possibility of life in the solar system's most toxic oceans, click the video on screen. See you in the Curiosity Gap.